And and on the second half of this presentation, we are going to be writing poetry. The first half is why write poetry, and the second half is actually writing poetry, because this is on how poetry can influence your writing and why poetry matters. But part of how poetry can influence your writing is you have to write poetry and read poetry. So first we're going to talk about poetry, and then we're going to write some poetry. So good poetry, like good music, has a way of going beyond words. It reaches into your soul. It touches your emotions. It touches your understanding in a way that fiction can't. And I'm sure you've all heard a poem or a song that just moves you. And this is what poetry does to your writing. If you start practicing writing poetry, if you read poetry, you start learning more about how poetry and words influence you and influence your writing. And you find yourself starting to put that into your own writing. So poetry can be anything you want it to be. It can rhyme, it can have meter, it can have a strong beat, it can have a specific beat count per line. It can be whatever you want. It can be a form, it can be blank verse, it can be put to music and sung, it can evoke emotion, it can paint a picture, it can be prose. There's prose poetry and narrative poetry. So poetry can be a lot of things. A lot of what we see now is blank verse, which is not a specific form, and every poem has its own form. Because when you write poetry, you create the form that works for you, whether it's the number of lines in a stanza, the rhyming, the number of beats per line, how the poem looks on the page is also important to poetry. And so all of this is up to the writer a lot of the time. So poetry is very subjective. There's some of my favorite poetry that came out of the 16, 17, 1800s, when you have some amazing poetry. Some of the earliest writing was poetry. So poetry has been a part of our culture, our world history. For as long as we have recorded history, we have records of poetry. So that's why, it's one of the reasons why poetry matters, is because it's a part of our collective conscience. It's a part of our history. It's a part of what makes us people. And today it has migrated. It has changed, just like language changes, poetry changes. And a lot of the poetry we're seeing now is we're seeing beat poetry. We're seeing, wow, my mind just blanked. We're seeing story poetry. We're seeing slam poetry. We're seeing performance poetry. And it kind of reminds me of what came out of the beatnik movement of the 1950s. And this is an amazing way that poetry is becoming alive, as you see people perform it. A number of years ago, there was a young man who was a performance poet who won America's Got Talent as a poet, and his poetry was amazing. If you didn't see that, if you haven't heard about him, look him up, because this is a way that poetry has evolved. And we can have this in our stories. We can use this to influence how we write and what we write and why we write. So first, I want you to close your eyes, because right now I want you to listen to 3 examples of poetry. I want you to listen to the words and just listen to how it feels. The first one is by Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. And let's see, I have it memorized, but sometimes if I'm not paying attention, I slip in the wrong word. So if you know this, I apologize in advance if I don't get every word right. Okay, 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Okay, and Steve is going to share 2 others, and then we're going to talk about them for a moment. Steve, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I was still muted. This
Okay.
one is called Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the morning flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in a fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some degree of, or for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. The next one is of a much lighter vein. This is called To My Valentine by Ogden Nash. More than a catbird hates a cat, or a criminal hates a clue, or the Axis hates the United States, that's how much I love you. I love you more than a duck can swim, and more than a grapefruit squirts. I love you more than gin rummy is a bore, and more than a toothache hurts. As a shipwrecked sailor hates the sea, or a juggler hates a shove, as a hostess detests unexpected guests, that's how much you I love. I love you more than a wasp can sting, and more than the subway jerks. I love you as much as a beggar needs a crutch, and more than a hangnail irks. I swear to you by the stars above and below, if such there be, as the high court loathes perjurious oaths, that's how much you're loved by me.
Okay, I would like you, if you wish, to unmute or and share how those poems affected you. And if you don't want to share verbally, share them in the chat.
There was a word that was used in ecstasy, which I've never used seen in the second poem, that I never heard it as in context of something other than something good. But is ecstasy, I mean, maybe I'm never.
No, that is supposed to be a positive word, but the way they're using it is to draw attention to it.
Oh, okay.
And to make you see it in a different way. So yes.
I thought it was interesting that the third one, My Valentine, basically compares the size of his love for this person to the size of how much everyone else hates these various things, like the Axis hating America or a shipwrecked sailor hating the sea. And I thought that was an interesting point of contrast and comparison.
I thought
Since
it would
love
make
and
a
hate
great,
are usually intermixed some way.
I thought it would make a great marriage vow.
can see that.
But you do think of love in a different way with that comparison, because we're more used to the superlatives, and then comparing it to all these negative things. Well, I love you more than a duck can swim. Like, oh, okay, well, it's a lot, but I like that. And okay,
the second one,
yeah.
the Dulce et Decorum Est, is such a harsh, very contrast to the other two. We have a moment of reflection, then we have silly one of love, and here we have an absolute harsh, resounding condemnation of war and World War I, if I'm not mistaken, with the
Yes.
gas. And then Dulce et Decorum Est, it is sweet and right to die for your country, but it's in Latin, which is like,
Yeah.
That's how long we've been doing this. This is like what I love that final bit. I mean, if I could write that, I'd be happy. That was really nice. I thought, and it was very powerful the way it's brought in and timely. All of it's what I like about these as well. When you, particularly with the last two that you pointed out, is it reminds us that you don't have to go back and sound like Shelley to write a good poem.
Mhm.
Modern references are every bit as good. So thanks for that.
As
Yeah,
a
I
veteran,
deliberately-
I had to practice that one an awful lot before I could get through it without tearing up.
Yeah, it's a
I-
powerful one.
Yeah, and
Yes.
I was terrible. I didn't tell him what it was, because I was looking for modern poems, because I love Shelley, I love Yeats, I love Shakespeare. But I wanted to get examples that were more contemporary, that were more relatable, that to put across my point. And I was going through a bunch of poems. This one is one that Dulce et Decorum Est is one that I first heard in high school. My English teacher, a wonderful English teacher who changed my life, because she exposed me, to amazing literature, and she explained literature, so I understood it. And this one affected me then, and it still resonates with me some decades later. And I had my husband read it, and I did not tell him what it was or what it was about.
Brat.
And yes, he broke down, because he was in Operation Desert Storm. And even though he did not see combat, he was on the docks, but he had to spend a week in Graves Registry. And so it was,
For you non-military personnel, it's toe tagging.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah. So, and he had to put don mop gear and be exposed to gas. So this was something that he could relate to. No, Kiki. Sorry, my cat's like, hi, I want treats now. So he brought something of himself to it. And my point with that is we each bring something of our own lives, our own history to the poetry. It resonates with us in different ways because of our own personal experiences. And it's the same with music, because music is poetry that you simply sing or has a musical accompaniment. But it brings something of ourselves. And because it's so concise and it's so tightly written, it carries more meaning, and it affects us in a stronger way because it is so compact, and the punch is more powerful, especially Dulce et Decorum Est, that is a gut punch, especially that last line about how sweet it is to die for your country. And then it's all about the terrible things that happen and what war is really like. But then I love Two Roads. I love The Road Not Taken because it is contemplative. And I almost went with Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Morning, because snowy evening. Yeah, the brain likes to switch things up, because I love Frost. Frost is one of my favorite poets. And then Ogden Nash, because poetry is humorous. And poetry can be fun. It can be whatever you want. But the more you read poetry, the more you understand poetry, and the more you understand why words matter, why every single word matters.
yeah.
I don't want to jump too far ahead. So
So much weight on those words,
Yeah.
Anyway, I should shut up.
yes.
I'm so excited about this, and I'm so bad at this. Just carry on.
Someone just put in the chat, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep, which is the last lines of Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. And that's a poem about suicide or contemplating suicide. That's one of the themes in that poem. But yeah, the way you put words together, and as you practice this, and I'm gonna cover this a little bit more. I don't want to jump ahead. I tend to jump ahead with my notes. I cover everything, but I put them out of order, and that's not good with the presentation. But to talk more, to show how poetry can help you with your longer writing, with your fiction, your short stories, your novels. I've got 3 examples that my husband is going to read. And all 3 of these examples are by authors who write poetry and longer fiction. Okay, Steve?
The first one I think you'll recognize right off the bat. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. The second is from Winnie the Pooh by A.A. Milne. Here is Edward Bear coming downstairs now, bump, bump, bump on the back of his head behind Christopher Robin. It is, as far as he knows, the only way of coming downstairs, but sometimes he feels that there really is another way, if only he could stop bumping for a moment and think of it. And then he feels that perhaps there isn't. Anyhow, here he is at the bottom and ready to be introduced to you, Winnie the Pooh. The next one is from Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach. It was morning, and the new sun sparkled gold across the ripples of a gentle sea. A mile from shore, a fishing boat chummed the water, and the word for breakfast flock flashed through the air till a crowd of 1,000 seagulls came to dodge and fight for bits of food. It was another busy day beginning. Charlie, you're muted.
Oh, I am muted because the cat. Someone put in the chat that Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening is also about having a lot to do in their life. Poetry often has multiple meanings. So yes, they're both correct. I had one teacher that saw a symbolism of death and suicide in the poem. Others see other things in the poem. So, okay. Any comments about those 3 first paragraphs?
There's definite imagery with Richard Bach's first paragraph of Jonathan Livingston Seagull. You can see the sun on the water. You can see the fishing boat throwing chum into the ocean to attract fish. It definitely gives you that sense of place.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was going to go with. Each one of these give a very visual representation. So along the lines where we're always being told, show, don't tell, these were very, very much showing what each one of these locations look like as they went through the descriptions.
And the words they use.
Yes.
The way they describe is very poetic. I love the bump, bump, bump of Edward Bear going down the stairs. Because you can just see that, just the bear being held over the shoulders. Christopher Robin goes down the stairs and the bear is just bouncing. And this is what poetry can do for your writing. It can help you come up with, you can describe something in fewer words and give better examples and a clearer picture of what you want by writing poetry. So it colors your writing with emotion. It colors it changes the way you look at words. And when you are writing poetry, you're looking at what the word is and what the word means. And is this the right word? And when you're writing fiction, sometimes it's, well, this is a good word. And this is close enough. But when you're writing poetry, close enough isn't always right. You have to keep looking. You go through dictionaries, you go through rhyming dictionaries. I love assistive technology because I will often ask my phone. I'll ask, I can't say her name because if
Alexa.
I do, she will that one because she will ask me what I want. And I will say, what is a synonym for this? What's an antonym for this? What's another word for this? And I'll get a whole list of words. And if I don't like any of them, I'll pick another word and I'll get synonyms for that to find the word I want that gives the feeling I want. And sometimes with poetry, it's all about the word. I actually, there's some words that I find are quite entertaining. One of them is defenestrate. I love the word defenestrate. It means to throw out a window. And so I actually used it in a poem. It's a Western zombie poem. And I used defenestrate because I wanted to. And I am very pleased with that. I don't know if other people are going to be as pleased with it. But sometimes that's what you want. That's the Yep. So sometimes just finding the right word. Evanescence. I actually titled a poem once Evanescence and wrote a whole poem about it, about the definition. Michael R. Collins has a book of several books of poetry. The first one was Words, Words, Words. I think he has more Words, 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 and then Dark Words, Words, Words. And it's all about words. He'll give you a word, the definition of the word, and then he'll write a poem about that word, using that word. And it's a wonderful way to illustrate how words matter. So poetry helps you look at what the word means, the connotations, the denotations, and what is the right word. I'm a member of the Red Butte Bards. It's one of my other poetry groups. It's one of my other chapters, one of my poetry groups. And they used alpenglow in a poem. And it's such a perfect word to describe something. So why describe it if you can just use alpenglow and that is the word and that is what you want? And that's the pinkish color on the mountains that the sun leaves on the mountains. I think it's sunset, you get that pinkish glow.
Petrichor.
And so finding the right words influences your poetry and it influences your writing. And when you are focusing on a few words and keeping it tight, you focus on the words, the right words. What words can you take out? I've had several poetry workshops with Michael R. Collins, and he was always talking about take out any words you don't need. Just the fewest words to get your meaning across. So poetry focuses on words. And so then when you're writing longer fiction, you're tightening up your words automatically because your brain is thinking about how can I put this across? How can I show this with the fewest number of words? Poetry, you can convey concepts, ideas, emotions,
So
imagery.
there's a question in the chat from Sobi.
Yeah.
Is it a problem that most people don't know what that word means?
No, it's not a problem. We as a people over the last 50 years have lost a lot of our vocabulary. We're changing our vocabulary. So there are a lot of words that you don't know. And it's okay if you see a word in a poem that you don't understand, look it up, or in a story, look it up. And it is okay to not know. I don't know every word and I will look it up. If there are too many words I don't know, I get frustrated. But a couple of words I'm okay with. So yes, it's okay. There we go, the definition of defenestrate.
I didn't know the word. I mean, I've thrown people out windows too. You'd think I'd know it.
And I figured for a zombie poem set in the Old West, defenestrate was perfect because how many barroom brawls end up with somebody being thrown out the window?
Outstanding. Outstanding.
So
how many people defenestrated, you meant to say?
There you go.
yep.
It's that famous thing. You're supposed to use the word, right? Then it gets stuck in there.
Yep.
And then everybody can look up the historical event called the Defenestration of Prague too. So
That's interesting.
That
That's
sounds
interesting.
like an interesting way to start like a murder mystery where where it's this man pondering the definition of defenestration when some mobster has been thrown out of a window.
Out of a 10th story window, and he's on this, and you're seeing the crime tape on the sidewalk below. Oh, The Simpsons, yes. So words, I love words. Okay, I was an English major. I have a bachelor's in English, so I love words. I love classic literature. I love older books and older poets, but the modern ones, there's some wonderful words. Okay, so poetry teaches you to write concisely, to say more with fewer words, because poetry, okay. Oh yeah, there's something about the Three Little Pigs by who on YouTube. Talks about how we've lost so many words. We've lost thousands of words.
What it says, if you want to hear a very amusing illustration of how we've lost so much of our vocabulary, listen to John Banyan's rendition of the Three Little Pigs on YouTube.
Yeah. So I just see how many words people know today versus how many words people knew in an average vocabulary in the 50s. So, okay, as I've mentioned before, poetry teaches you to write concisely. It teaches you how to say more with fewer words, because that's what you focus on. And as you write poetry, and as you're focusing on, I can only have so many syllables per line. I'm looking for iambic pentameter, which is a sonnet is iambic pentameter. And you have to get something that fits the rhyme, it fits the meter, it fits the number of beats. I wrote a poem that had 4 beats per line, and defenestrate is 4 beats. So it teaches you to write concisely. And as you get your brain focusing on tightening up, as you write longer fiction, you're still focusing on tightening up. Your brain is still going to be tightening things up and coming up with more concise ways to write. Okay. There you go. And poetry helps you think about your sentences, your paragraphs, and how words flow together. Not just for the individual word, but also putting words together. How do you put a word together? How do you put the sentence together to get the best meaning? To get the assonance, the alliteration, the internal rhyme, to get how to get the sounds of the verbs, connotation, denotation. So poetry helps you with this in your short fiction and your longer fiction. Okay, so writing poetry is simply the words that you use and the words that you choose. And it's the word. I'm trying to listen to my notes, and it keeps repeating itself, which is not helping. Poetry is simply the words that you choose and how you choose to put them together. And it's very simple, but it's very difficult to master. But the more you write, the easier it becomes, and the more it becomes natural to start writing things tightly. And the more that you read, poetry, the more that it becomes a part of what you are doing. So that we've already done the first paragraph examples. So
Examples
I
of
just
good
messed up my
poetry
husband by
books.
jumping around.
Examples of good poetry books.
Yep, I know. I delete my notes as I go along. So here are some examples if you want to read and find some really good examples of poetry. There's the Norton Anthology. Norton has anthologies of poetry. There's a Norton Anthology of English poetry of this century. That look up Norton anthologies. Oxford has a collection of American poetry, of British poetry. And so getting these and reading these will help you understand all the poetry that has been the most popular, has been famous. Why is this poetry still important today? And this helps you understand how poetry's evolved and to read some of the best poetry. If you have a favorite author, a favorite poet, buy a book of their poetry. You can get books that have the best 50 poems, the best 100 poems. Depends on who put them together. I love a book called The Poet's Corner. It's by John Lithgow, and his grandmother used to read him poetry. So he's put together a book of his favorite poems. And then in the audiobook, he gives you an introduction. He tells you what the poem is, the author, a bit about the author, a bit about the poem, and then another actor reads the poem. And then he will come back and give you other poems that he really likes by that poet. So it's a wonderful way to hear how the poetry is read by actors. And it is really nice. So I recommend that if you want to get a really good book. So, okay. Okay, so see, how much time do we have? Dan, how much longer do we get?
We're coming up on 8 o'clock, but you still have about 15, 20 minutes if you'd like.
Okay, so I'm gonna use it. We're gonna write poetry for about 20 minutes. So we got 10 minutes per poem. And I'm doing two different styles. So first is a limerick. And a limerick is, as you know, it's a 5-line poem. I love 5-line poems because they're short and they're tight. And the first line often starts with, there was a man from. They're often humorous, but they don't have to be. The first, the second, and the fifth lines rhyme. They are between 7 and 10 beats per line. So it's up to you, you pick it, but make sure that each has the same. I like 7 or 8. And then the second, and then the third and fourth lines rhyme, and they are 5 to 7 beats. So there's an example of a poem that you should all be familiar with. So I want to take 5 minutes and have you guys write a limerick and then share it. So Steve will leave the slide up. So there's a poem by Edric Lear. Do you want to read it, Steve?
Sure. There was an old man with a beard who said, "It is just as I feared. 2 owls and a hen, a lark and a wren have all built their nests in my beard."
Okay, so I want to take 5 minutes and have you guys write a limerick. It can be serious, it can be silly, it can be whatever you want. Okay. Ah. Okay. Okay. Now some are sharing them, although the first one Steve sent was somebody else's.
I adapted it for my own purposes. The only two lines that were original were there was an old man from Tobago who lived on rice gruel and sago. I came up with the second half.
Okay, we'll see if we may get to the second poem. We'll see what time is.
The proposed use for Nantucket in this way was inspired by 2.5 Men.
Could be. Okay.
All right, I got one, you schmucks.
Okay, let's hear it.
Sure. I told the barista to do as she pleased. My usual flavor now disagrees. So she mixed up some beans and fresh garden greens, which would empty my bowels guaranteed.
Nice. Okay.
I think you broke Daniel.
Okay, here's mine. There once was a vampire bride who spent all her daytimes inside. Then once for a lark, she left after dark. And now she has nothing but pride.
Oh, that's pretty good. That's pretty solid.
Cool. Okay. Let's see. Let's see how we're going. I've got so much more I want to cover. Okay, we'll jump back to Cinquain. Let's go to the end, and then if we have time, we'll jump back to Cinquain, Steve. Okay. When you're looking at form, if you're writing poetry, you have to look at what the form you're using. And or if you don't want to use form at all, it doesn't matter. If you pick a form like a limerick, a haiku, a tanka, a cinquain, a sonnet, look at it, look at the form, look at how the form works, look at the variations on the form, and decide if you want to do that or not. If you want blank verse, make up your own form. If you want it to not rhyme at all, that's up to you. If it's a prose poem or a narrative poem, they have their own form. Learn the form, read the form, and then write the form. So this is entirely up to you how you want to do this and what you want to do. Okay, also, especially with poetry, it's important to read it aloud to hear how the rhyme and the meter, how it flows. And if you stumble over something or it doesn't sound right, just look at it again. I like to have my computer read to me because then I hear more of the mistakes. I hear where it doesn't flow right. And I make a note and then I go back and fix it. You can also change things up with your poetry. Add a couplet to a haiku. Or if you want to make a haiku more difficult, rhyme the first and third lines. Haikus are 5-7-5. They're Japanese haikus are about nature, but a haiku doesn't have to be. You can write, instead of writing one limerick, write a poem that is 3 limericks. So write a poem that's forwards and backwards. Write it, however you want to change it up. And changing it up is going to help you think about things a little differently. And then once you start writing a poem, start thinking about your story, your work in progress, your novel, your short story as a poem, and start using poetry. It can help you think more about how you're going to use your fiction. Write your logline as a poem. You're not necessarily going to present it as a poem, but if you pick a style and write your logline in a poetic form, how is that going to come across? How's that going to make you think about your logline differently? Write a poem from your write a poem from your protagonist to your antagonist. What kind of a poem would your protagonist say? Write a poem from your antagonist's point of view. Write a poem take a theme for your poem and write it, maybe the theme of your work in progress. the novel or the short story you're working on. Take that theme, take that genre, and write a poem in that genre. I've actually done this a number of times. I have a short story coming out along Harrow Trails, and it's about a grandmother who fights zombies and is protecting her granddaughter fights vampires and is protecting her granddaughter from a vampire that's coming. So I wrote the short story, and then I wrote a poem. I submitted both to the anthology. The short story got accepted, the poem did not. I reworked the poem, I added some stuff I'd removed, and I sold that poem to a magazine. So sometimes if you looking at them both, looking at your idea, your story as a short story, as a poem, you see things differently, you look at them differently, you word them differently. And sometimes doing both can be a fun practice. You
We got
can
about
you can
what
write
about? Sorry, I'm just checking on time, Dan.
yeah, you can write a love poem to your favorite character. Write a poem that would be used in your world. Write the lyrics to a song that would be sung in your world. Look at Tolkien, look at Anne McCaffrey, and you can do some of this with these are different ways that you can change things up. If you want more, yeah, we'll look at Cinquain, but we're not gonna have a chance to write it. Take a class. M. Todd Gallowglass has a genre poetry workshop that he does, where he goes over writing poems, then writing poems for your character's point of view or something. Linda D. Addison often teaches a poetry class for Horror University. You can get books. There are a lot of books about writing. Michael R. Collins has one called The Art and Craft of Poetry. That is it's basically his semester-long class on poetry. And this is basically his semester on writing poetry. So you have different ways to write poetry, examples of poetry. If you want to rhyme, there's a website called rhymezone.net. Dictionaries and thesaurus online or in person, these are all amazing and use them. Okay. Okay, I did not get to the Cinquain. Cinquain's my favorite form. The Cinquain is a 5-line poem. Just to go over it really quickly, you can write this later. Here's your homework, write a Cinquain. There are 2 ways. The American Cinquain has syllables. It's 2 syllables, 4 syllables, 6 syllables, 8 syllables, 2 syllables. And and it can be iambic. It normally has one stressed, one unstressed line syllable. So if it's 2 syllables, one is stressed, one's unstressed, but you can play with that. It doesn't have to follow that. There is a didactic Cinquain that use words, 1 word, 2 words, 3 words, 4 words, 1 word. And there's a specific form. You have the title. Where's line 2? Line 2 is 2 adjectives that describe the subject of the title. Line 3 is a 3-word phrase that's usually 3 gerunds that describes it. Line 4 is 4 words, their feelings describing the subject, and line 5 is a single word synonym to the title. So write a Cinquain. Cinquains are my favorite. So look those up, write some poems, go home tonight or go stand at your computer tonight and write some poetry and see how writing poetry is going to make you a better writer overall and write with better descriptions. So thank you again for coming. Sorry, I ran a little bit long, but I kind of waxed poetic. No, I'm doing okay. But thank you so much. Read poetry, write poetry, experience poetry, because poetry is going to help you become a better writer. And sometimes poetry can be used in your work as well. So thank you very much. And I appreciate your participation.
Yay, thank you, Charlie.
Yes, thank you. That was wonderful.
So you
I
race
actually-
through the end.
I actually, one of the assignments